Two things that I thought would be important for my project were two of End Slavery Now's actions, one of them being learning the facts around sex trafficking, and the other being debunking the myths associated with human trafficking. So I've put together a little visual aid to better highlight some of the key arguments that each of the sources is making.
In the United States, sex trafficking involves three elements: the process, the means, and the goal. The U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act defines sex trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of an individual who, under force, fraud, or coercion, is induced to perform a commercial sex act. In the United States, any person under the age of 18 in commercial sex acts is automatically considered a victim of sex trafficking under the law. It's important to note that sex trafficking does not have to involve some form of travel, transportation, or movement across borders. At its core, sex trafficking is characterized by sexual exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion. Similarly, the international definition of sex trafficking defines it as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons who, under threat, force, coercion, fraud, deception, or abuse of power, are sexually exploited for the financial gain of another. False promises are ways traffickers bait and enslave their victims. Victims often live in poverty. Most lack rights and access to basic services such as education, which make them particularly vulnerable to sex trafficking. Many times, people are offered false employment opportunities. Poor and/or marginalized men and women, under the promise of an employment opportunity, employment needed for their survival, become entrapped in slavery after trusting what they thought was a friendly labor recruiter. These individuals are abused, threatened, sold into the sex industry, and forced to perform commercial sex acts. Traffickers keep victims under their control by saying they'll be free after they pay their debt. Their debt is supposedly from victims' recruitment, transportation, upkeep, etc. Like debt peonage that stemmed from the labor settlement following emancipation, indebtedness is used as an instrument of compulsion. Victims are in a constant cycle of trying to pay off their debt while simultaneously accumulating more. Attempting to pay off this debt may result in the victim becoming a recruiter and trapping other victims in this cruel system. When sex trafficking victims are caught, I think this word choice by End Slavery Now's article is a purposeful choice because while victims are rescued in a sense, the blame is placed on the trafficked. Therefore, it's likely victims become detained and prosecuted for criminal activity like prostitution. Not only must victims endure the consequences of a legal charge and social ostracism to their newly freed name, they are still left with the permanent and scarring effects of being enslaved and exploited, not to mention the bodily harm done. These individuals may battle with sexually transmitted diseases they received, drug addiction, malnutrition, and more. I think this graphic from Traffic Watch is important to include because it shows the parallels of the slave trade of 1886 to now modern day slavery and just the sheer magnitude of people involved and the amount of people involved due to human trafficking. And now we'll get into debunking myths about human trafficking. The first myth being modern slavery isn't related to my life. The reality is, modern slavery is woven into our daily lives through the products we buy, services we use. Goods and services are examples of how slavery can lie latently in our lives, yet human trafficking can occur right in front of our eyes, and we don't even know unless we can recognize the signs of a trafficked individual. Another myth is that expensive goods are unlikely to have been made using trafficked forced labor. A higher price is never a guarantee that a product is slave-free. A reliable measure would be looking for an actual indicator on the good showing that this product was made using ethical labor. If we go back to the graphic from Traffic Watch, we can see that sexual slavery only accounts for 8% of modern day slavery. So while many women are trafficked into commercial selling of sex, domestic work is the largest single industry for forced labor in the US, and the vast majority of domestic workers are women. Another myth is that human trafficking only affects women and girls. The International Organization for Migration estimates 28% of trafficking victims worldwide are male. Men and boys make up around 6% of victims trafficked into sexual exploitation. The final myth provided by Freedom United is that one person can't make an impact on modern slavery. And I think this is a good myth to end on and debunk, as it's the whole premise for this project of showing how any individual can contribute to acts of abolition. End Slavery Now shows this by providing their action library, just a conglomerate of different forms of abolition for different forms of slavery.
Abolition begins with awareness. So we must first become educated and cognizant of these issues, aware of how modern slavery works. Once we become educated, then we can effectively abolish